This is Occupier Kaylin coming to you live again from the Des Moines Social Club.
If we can go. Is that me? No. Hi there. Is it on? Can you hear me okay? No?
No.
Oh, okay. Just tell me when.
Try another mic check.
Am I good now?
There you go.
Hi there, everybody. Thank you for coming this evening. My name is Katie Herder, and I am the Middle East Peace Building Associate with the American Friends Service Committee. And we are absolutely thrilled to have you all here this evening tonight, and thrilled to have our brand new Midwest Regional Director of the American Friends Service Committee, Rabbi Rosen, here with us this evening to share insights and inspiration with all of us tonight. A quick background on Brant. Rabbi Brant Rosen, he, as I said, is the new Midwest Regional Director of AFSC. Before coming to AFSC, he served as a congressional rabbi for over 20 years, including 17 years at the Jewish Reconstructionist Congregation in Evanston, Illinois. Rabbi Rosen is the co-founder and co-chairperson of the Jewish Voice for Peace's Rabbinical Council, and was the founder, with Rabbi Brian Walt, of the Jewish Fast for Gaza. He's also the author of the amazing and popular blog Shalom Rab, where he writes about the intersection between Judaism and social justice, and the book Wrestling in the Daylight, A Rabbi's Path to Palestinian Solidarity, which was published in 2012. So please, without further ado, give a warm welcome to Rabbi Brant Rosen.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you all for coming tonight. This is a very special gig for me. I was in Des Moines not too long ago. It was, I think, a little over a year ago, after my book came out, and I was invited by the American Friends Service Committee to speak at Drake, and gave a talk there, and had no idea that I would be coming back to Des Moines as a staff person for AFSC, and I'm really thrilled to be back in this capacity, and look forward to getting to know the Des Moines community. You are on my circuit. I will be here a great deal. And I'm very thankful to the Iowa office of AFSC, to Kathleen and to John and to Katie and the entire staff for really being good friends and colleagues and part of this important community that's doing this very sacred work. You know, when Katie described my blog as investigating the intersection between Judaism and social justice, I mean, I really think it goes beyond any one of our spiritual traditions, whatever they might happen to be. I think we are all part of the same tribe. We are all part of the same movement, and we are walking hand in hand in this movement for justice together, whatever spiritual tradition has brought us to this place. And so, yes, I'm a rabbi, but I'm also a Quaker now. And I think really the values that underlie all of our spiritual traditions ultimately converge into one place, and that is that we acknowledge the source of all life that demands that we stand for justice, and that God is the God that hearkens to the cry of the oppressed and asks that we do the same. And that is the case no matter what house of worship we happen to be praying in. So I'm here tonight and I'm honored to be the one who is bringing home this exhibit, this remarkable exhibit that I want to say a few words about. I'm very honored to be at the closing event. I know there have been some very, very special events in conjunction with that exhibit. And in fact, the first time I came across this exhibit, it was by accident, actually. I was taking my son a few years ago to visit colleges, and Guilford College in North Carolina was one of them. And I just happened on this exhibit. And at the time, and I spent a great deal of time looking at it, and really, at the time, it was very clear to me what a brilliant idea it was for AFSC to mount an exhibit like this, because I think it really helps us, well, it helps us do many things. It helps us to learn about the power of art in promoting social justice. It helps us connect the dots between all of these various movements throughout history that were addressing specific moments in time, but really are part of a larger tradition of civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance. And I think the boycott exhibit gives us a very effective way of really learning about how important these movements are. Not only because they inspire us and that they are venerable, and movements like the American movement for civil rights in the South, or United Farm Workers, at this point we look back on them and we venerate them. But it's important to realize that these were struggles, And there's a quote in the description of the exhibit that I think is very, very important. That as much as we celebrate these movements today, we need to bear in mind that these are very real struggles for justice. And the line that just jumps out for me when describing these posters, it says, "Their intention is to compel viewers to pay attention to issues many may find uncomfortable and would rather ignore." And I'm going to return to that line a few times during the course of my talk. I also think the boycott exhibit is brilliant because it really folds what I believe is the most important current movement for justice through civil disobedience and nonviolent means, namely the Palestinian civil society call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And it really helps us to understand that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. This is part of a much longer tradition. And the exhibit really helps us to understand that it's a certain point in time right now that makes many people uncomfortable, but in fact is part of a much longer movement, and that is the struggle through nonviolent means for justice and equity and equality. To this end, by the way, if you haven't come across it, there's a wonderful book I would recommend to all of you. It came out, I think, 2 years ago, called Why Civil Disobedience Works by Erica Chenoweth. And she does a magnificent job in this book of explaining, she has several case studies, including some Palestinian struggles, nonviolent struggles during the First Intifada, the American civil rights struggle, South Africa, the South African anti-apartheid movement, and really tries to show not only that these are important movements, but that they're effective, that they historically, and she uses very rigorous sociological research to prove her point, that these nonviolent resistance movements actually are enormously and historically effective. And when it comes to social change, societies have a much better chance at creating democratic regimes when they replace oppressive regimes, when the struggle is inherently nonviolent as opposed to violent resistance. So that's another resource that I would commend to you to understand these images that you see around this room and to help put them into context. But I'm here to talk to you about, as I said before, the most current act of civil resistance, civil disobedience that we're learning more and more about every day, and that is the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. I want to talk a little bit about the background of this movement, a little bit about why I believe it's so very important and why I personally have been participating in it for the last several years, why it might seem odd that a rabbi is participating in this movement, but in fact I'm part of a growing number of Jews who are waking up to understand that this is a movement that's worthy of our support. And then to address some of the common criticisms that are leveled at the BDS movement and really unpack them a little bit so that we can better understand why I believe this is such an important movement and worthy of our support. And then after all of that, I will open it up for questions and to look forward to having conversation. I always say whenever I speak, I may say things you agree with, I may say things you disagree with, and that's all good. and I think we're all here to learn from one another. It's okay to disagree, and I look forward to having real conversation. And if there's anything that's said that you take exception to, I encourage you to let me know, and we can dialogue on it together. The point is not to convince each other of the rightness of our views, but rather to create a space where we can air these views on issues that, yes, may make us uncomfortable, but we're here in the spirit of that line that I read, that we are here because we prefer not to simply ignore them, but to embrace the discomfort and struggle through together. So, a little bit about the history of the BDS movement, and I'm sure many of you in the room may be familiar with some of these points I'm about to make. The BDS movement, such as it is, really dates back to 2005, when a consortium of Palestinian civil society organizations, NGOs, labor movements, professional guilds, etc., came together and issued a call to the international community for support for their struggle. And they were calling for nonviolent support for a specific approach that used three tactics: boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Boycott meaning boycott of Israeli consumer goods, cultural boycott, academic boycott. Divestment, and largely divestment is referring to companies and corporations that profit from Israel's occupation. So these are military contractors, companies like Hewlett-Packard, that are involved in the security system that is very operative throughout the West Bank and the wall between the West Bank and Israel. Caterpillar Corporation is a common company that's targeted for divestment, which Caterpillar makes the armored and weaponized bulldozers that destroy Palestinian homes. There are many different divestment campaigns that I'm sure you're aware of. There are campus campaigns that are ongoing. There are religious organizations that are calling for divestment of their holdings, and really encouraging people to look at the way they make their investments to engage in socially responsible investment. And then sanctions. And sanctions, of course, are what governments do. There are three basic goals to the BDS movement, and actually this poster right here lists them.
You might be limited on your cord length.
Yeah, I'm on a leash. All right, let's see if I can read them from here. I totally can. All right, well, I know them by heart anyways. One is Israel needs to end its occupation of Palestinian lands. The second is full equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. And the third is a recognition of the Palestinian right of return for refugees who were ethnically cleansed from Palestine in 1948 and 49, recognizing their right of return to their homes that was enshrined by the UN and by international law. So these are the three basic goals of the BDS movement: the occupation, equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel, and the right of return. And I wanted to say a little bit about those three things because they're very, very crucial and very important to understanding the reality that that has been facing Palestinians for decades. We hear a great deal about the peace process, the so-called peace process between Israel and the PA, dating back most recently to the Oslo Accords that began in the early 90s. And what has been happening since then has been a gradual entrenching of Israel's occupation under the guise of negotiations. And we've reached a point now through a process of settlement, of increased Jewish settlement in the occupied territories, particularly in Area C. Through the Oslo Accords, the West Bank was divided into areas A, B, and C. C is the largest. It's over 60% of the West Bank. And it is the area that is the most contiguous and contains the largest Jewish settlement blocks. There's been a process of construction of Jewish settlements of expropriation of Palestinian land, demolition of Palestinian homes, and eviction of Palestinians from these areas. And this has gradually been going on along with the increasing of the settlement regime. In other words, a series of checkpoints that is completely carving up the West Bank and separating Palestinians from one another, and in many cases, separating Palestinians from their own lands, their own olive groves, and their own means of livelihood. In many cases, the wall, the so-called security wall that Israel has set up, doesn't separate Israel from the West Bank. It cuts into the West Bank and often separates whole villages from their sources of livelihood. So this has been a process that has been ongoing, that Israel has been doing with impunity. And it is an enormously oppressive reality for Palestinians living in these circumstances under the guise, the facade of negotiations. If you've ever been to the West Bank, you can see it with your own eyes, and it's very difficult to imagine how any kind of viable, contiguous Palestinian state can be created under these circumstances. In fact, what we're seeing is a retrenchment of Israel's occupation and control over Palestinians with kind of a fiction of statehood. And that is what has been referred to when we talk about the two-state solution. I've heard Palestinians refer to the West Bank as Swiss cheese, almost. There are these little bantustans, these little isolated pockets of Palestinian villages and population centers where they have maybe some semblance of local control, but overall the control is under the Israeli military. The other very important thing to remember is that in the West Bank there are two sets of laws, depending on what your ethnicity of religion is. Jewish settlers in the West Bank live under civil law. Palestinians live under military law, under Israeli military law. We have two sets of laws for two people based strictly on whether they're Jewish or not. There is a legal separation between the two people. And it pains many Jews to use the word apartheid to describe this situation, but that is the very definition of apartheid. When you have a legally enforced separation between two people based on their ethnicity, that is what we are talking about when we talk about apartheid, and that is the reality that is becoming entrenched in the West Bank. And this is going on with impunity. It is against the stated policy of the American government, but the American government up until now has not seen fit to hold Israel to account. In fact, our country enables Israel. Our country gives $3 billion of military aid a year to Israel. So we are actively supporting this entrenchment that I am describing. And yet the United States is often referred to as the so-called honest broker in these negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, but there's no equity in this so-called peace process. And there never has been up until this point. That might be changing, I'll talk about that later, but for now, the frustration of the Palestinians is that there is nobody who is holding Israel to account. Israel can do what Israel is doing with utter impunity and without any consequences whatsoever. And so the BDS call is a way of appealing to the international community for popular support for their cause, the way all of these movements have done throughout history, to say that there is injustice ongoing, there is oppression ongoing, and we are calling for popular support for our cause. And there are ways that everybody out there can participate in helping in this act of resistance, and that's through boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So the first one was the occupation, which I just described. The second is equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. I've often heard the description between comparing the reality to being a Palestinian in the West Bank to being a Palestinian citizen of Israel as comparing a situation of apartheid, as I just described it, to in Israel proper being more akin to Jim Crow in the American South. In other words, if you're going to be Palestinian, I think it's much better to be a Palestinian citizen of Israel than to live under military occupation. There's no question. but I think it is highly disingenuous for people to say, well, Palestinians have full rights just like Jewish Israelis. Palestinian citizens of Israel are second-class citizens of Israel. And there are many, many documented examples of this. I highly recommend the organization Adalah, that is really devoted to the civil rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel. And they have documented over 50 examples, and there are many, many more actually than that, of ways that there is structural discrimination against Palestinian citizens of Israel, whether it is access to public resources, whether it's public schools, whether it's housing, whether it's income. And when you think about it, how could this not be the case? Right? Israel was founded to be the Jewish state. Right? Israel was founded to be the state of the Jews. And this is, I'll touch on this a little bit later too. It's worthy of a whole other talk. But when you think about it, if you have a state that is predicated on the identity, the religious and ethnic identity of one people exclusively, in a land that has historically been multi-ethnic and multi-religious, and you're imposing that system in this land, how could there not be tension? How can there not be conflict? And how could someone who's not Jewish not be considered as other in some way? To be a non-Jew in a Jewish state is inherently problematic. And there is structural racism in all societies. But the kind of structural racism that we are seeing that results from Zionism is built into the very idea of Zionism itself. And, you know, that it's painful to say that as a Jew, but I think it's a reckoning that we have to really seriously deal with. That the issue is not simply the occupation. The issue is not simply one that we need to find some kind of two-state solution for. The issue goes to my mind, goes to the heart of what it means to found an ethno-national state, a state that's predicated on the identity of one people. So the second part of the call is for full equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. How that happens needs to be negotiated. The final parameters of that solution, whether it's one state, two states, 50 states, the first order of business is to shine a light on the inequity and the discrimination, and this is an integral part of the call. And the third is a recognition of the right of return. So there are many different populations of Palestinians. I mentioned the ones in the West Bank. There's also Gaza, which we haven't touched on, which is probably the most dire, or among the most dire. Palestinian citizens of Israel. Then we have Palestinian refugees. Many are in Gaza, but also in refugee camps in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan. And then there's a Palestinian diaspora across the world. Millions and millions of Palestinians who are descendants of the original 700,000 Palestinians who were ethnically cleansed from their homes in Palestine when Israel was founded. After this happened, there was a UN resolution that called for their return to their homes, that Israel promptly and ever since has ignored. And that right of return and this is something that many people don't understand about Palestinians, because I think in the Jewish community, the right of return is just treated as a non-starter. It's treated as, well, that would mean the end of a Jewish state. If all these refugees suddenly came back to their homes, they would just overwhelm and outnumber the Jewish residents, and there'd be no Jewish state. So we can't even entertain the idea of the right of return. One thing that we need to keep in mind is that the right of return for just about every Palestinian, and Palestinians are a very diverse bunch, just like every community, and they agree or disagree about any number of things. But I would say that among the things that they almost have unanimous agreement on is that the right of return is sacrosanct. That is what keeps them going. It is what the dream of return to their homes, from which they were just so brutally uprooted, has never died, and it's lasted through the generations. If anything, it's gotten stronger through the generations. How that right of return will eventually be implemented is not clear, but it needs to be recognized and respected by the United States and by the international community and by Israel. It's enshrined in international law. It is not beyond the realm of possibility that refugees can be repatriated. It happens all the time. It's not some messianic idea. It is a concept that's rooted in very real historic precedent. And so that is the third part of the BDS call, is a recognition of the right, of that right, and a respecting that right. How does it put it there? Israel respects the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. Okay, so those are the three goals of the BDS movement. And the BDS movement, it's important to bear in mind that it is coming from a huge swath of Palestinian society, of Palestinian civil society. And it is a very, I think, effective way for ordinary citizens, rather than simply waiting and hoping that our governments will do the right thing, to actively participate in the solution, into leveraging people power to shift political power. And that's what all of these campaigns were about. If you wanted to put it in a nutshell, these movements for nonviolent resistance to oppression were all about leveraging popular support, people power, to eventually shift political power. And we, as I said before, we venerate many of these movements today. The American Civil Rights Movement is now sacred. You know, we just saw this amazing gathering in Selma not too long ago, and there's now a movie about it. And we talk about Martin Luther King as this iconic American figure who, not that long ago, was an enormously controversial person who was making this country feel very, very uncomfortable about how it behaved, and not only in the South, by the way. So it's remarkable to me how we can venerate these movements over a period of time, but when we're in the moment of them, we say, well, I'm not sure, that I'm not completely comfortable with this. That's in fact the point of these movements, is to upset the status quo, to make us uncomfortable, to shine a light on a very brutal reality so that we can be participating in the solution. I want to address some criticisms that we often hear, and you know, I'm a member of the Jewish community, so I hear them a great deal. And I think it's important to unpack them, because I think there's a great deal of misinformation that's being bandied about when it comes to the BDS movement. There is a very, very strong backlash against BDS. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. The Israeli government and many Jewish institutions that are Israel advocating organizations have spent a great deal of time and energy and money, literally hundreds of millions of dollars, in combating BDS, in pushing back against BDS. There is a campaign that comes out of the Israeli government called Brand Israel, which is a PR campaign that is meant to address some of the bad publicity that comes with the BDS movement. And what I would say, the first thing I would say, is that this is a very compelling reason as to why BDS is so effective. If you want to gauge if a movement is effective, just take a look at the reaction of the people who are targeted by it. Last year, when Netanyahu spoke at the AIPAC convention in Washington, he wasn't there. Not this year, but last year, or this year as well, to a certain extent. He spent most of his time talking about BDS, talking about divestment movements and how horrible and how anti-Semitic they are. Israel and Israel supporters are taking this very, very seriously, and they're pushing back hard. And I would say that is a sign of the potential effectiveness of this movement. It is getting Israel's attention the way no other form of leverage has. And I think we're seeing, as a result, a doubling down in the BDS movement and many, many successes. We've seen on the divestment front, the Presbyterian General Assembly last spring, almost a year ago in Detroit, passed a divestment resolution divesting from several companies that benefit from the occupation, including Hewlett-Packard and Motorola Solutions and Caterpillar. You are seeing across the country campus divestment movements that are just growing by leaps and bounds. And in my own backyard in Evanston, Northwestern University, on its very first try, and this is amazing actually, this is a great microcosm, passed a student-led divestment resolution in student government. This was about 2 months ago. I got a call from a young man who, there was an email, said, "Oh, Rabbi Rosen, I haven't talked to you since you did my bar mitzvah several years ago, but I'm a Northwestern student. I'm involved with Students for Justice in Palestine, and we just started a divestment push, and we wanted you to come speak at Northwestern." And I did, and this was, Northwestern is not historically a very political campus, and the opposition they were facing was absolutely fierce. And this was just the first go-around of some students, most of whom were very new at this, but were very passionate about the cause, and were very smart and very focused in the way they went about it. And I went and spoke, and the resolution passed about 2 weeks later. And I was just in awe of the work these young people were doing. And the fact that a young man whose bar mitzvah I did was the one who invited me to come do this, to me is just a tiny little microcosm of how I think this paradigm is starting to shift, not only on campuses, but in the Jewish community. I'm seeing a growing generation of young Jews whose relationship to Israel is fundamentally different than previous generations, and the assumptions they're growing up with when it comes to Israel are very, very different. So I see this as an enormously effective tool to help shift the status quo that I was describing earlier. So to address some of the criticisms, the first one you will often hear is that it's a double standard, that why are we singling out Israel? Of all of the horrible regimes in the world, right, and there are many, unfortunately, and many that are worse than Israel. These patently oppressive totalitarian regimes, why are we singling out Israel, which is, after all, a democracy and an ally of the United States, for this kind of targeted activism? And I think that criticism, it's a very important criticism because I think it helps clarify what BDS is and what BDS isn't. First of all, I think it's on its face a problematic criticism because yes, that's true. There are worse regimes than Israel, but here we have any host of issues that need to be dealt with. Are we saying that they are not worthy of our attention just because there happen to be others? But that's not really the key issue. The key issue to me is that BDS is not, and this might sound odd, but this is very important, BDS is not a human rights campaign, right? BDS did not result from the world looking over at Palestinians, or looking around the world and saying, oh, we're going to support the Palestinians. Right? It's not coming from Western society sort of through noblesse oblige and trying to better the lot of oppressed people. BDS is a grassroots call that is coming from Palestinians themselves. It's not a human rights so much as it is a liberation campaign. The real question before us is not, what about all these other countries? The real question is, we have this oppressed people that is asking for our support. Do we think their ask, their call is worthy of our support? And if so, will we support them? That's really the issue. If there are other countries around the world, if there are other peoples who are oppressed, who are coming together and issuing this call through civil society for nonviolent resistance, I think we would do well to consider them and to support them if we felt they were just. But in the absence of those calls, that doesn't mean we shouldn't respond to the Palestinians. We need to understand that this is not our campaign, this is their campaign. And our involvement in this campaign is not generated from our concern. It's generated from their call for support. And I think we really need to grapple with what it means to stand in solidarity. It means to allow them to be the leaders and to dictate the terms of what their liberation will look like. And if we choose to stand with them, that means we stand behind them. And so that's perhaps the most important thing to understand about BDS and all of these struggles, is that when you look around the room, these were all grassroots struggles that were coming from the heart of the communities that were being directly oppressed. And the reason they succeeded is because there were constituencies of people, including people of very real privilege, who were able to stand next to them or behind them and support their struggles and allow them to dictate the terms and to lead the way toward their eventual liberation. That's something that Erica Chenoweth in her book, Why Civil Disobedience Works, she points out that this is among the most important reasons why it works and why it can be so effective is when the actual grassroots leadership is truly allowed to be the architects of their own liberation. So that's number one. Number two, a criticism you often hear, and I hear this in particular when it comes to campus divestment efforts, is you hear that, well, you know what, this just opens the door to anti-Semitism. When you are singling out the Jewish state, that just starts sort of a slippery slope towards singling out Jews. And what might start as an effort to hold Israel to account ends up really targeting Jews around the world who may or may have nothing to do with the state of Israel. And you often hear that Jewish students on campuses feel personally targeted when these divestment resolutions are brought to bear, when they're debated in student government. They often feel that they themselves have been victims of anti-Semitism as a result of these campaigns. I think, while I don't dismiss the discomfort that many Jews feel around BDS, I think it's very, very important to really unpack what's going on. And I want to go back to the statement I read at the very beginning. Their intention is to compel viewers to pay attention to issues many may find uncomfortable and would rather ignore. And I would argue that what many Jews describe as feeling as being made to feel targeted is really being made to feel uncomfortable. And I think there's a big difference between the two. And I think it's important, particularly when we think about the rhetoric that Israel uses to justify its existence as a Jewish state. I mean, Israel positions itself as the state of the Jews, of all Jews. And you hear Netanyahu saying this over and over, for instance. You hear him say, you heard him say before he came to the United States to speak before Congress, he says, I am coming to represent all Jews. Do people remember hearing this statement? He sees himself, or positions himself, I'm not sure if he actually sees himself this way, but certainly in the rhetoric that he uses, not only as the prime minister of a political nation state in the Middle East, but in fact a spokesperson for all Jews everywhere. And that's a tactic that he uses to gain political legitimacy for his party and for his nation. But what that rhetoric ends up doing, I think, is very, very damaging. Because it implicates all Jews in the actions of the Jewish state. So it makes it very, very difficult for people to distinguish between Zionism and Judaism, or between Israelis, Jewish Israelis, and Jews throughout the world. And I think it's very telling that when he went to Europe, for instance, when he went to France after the Charlie Hebdo massacre, and tried to suggest to the French Jews that they should flee to Israel and live in the only Jewish state in the world because they were unsafe in France, he encountered very harsh resistance from the leadership of the Jewish community of France, because I think European Jews as uncomfortable as they might be in certain circumstances with their reality, understand that this is their home, and they resent being implicated in the acts of another country. So inasmuch as there is anti-Semitism, I'm not sure that it comes from BDS. I think Israel needs to reckon with the ways that its actions serves to inflame anti-Semitism around the world. I think that's a much more serious issue than a liberation movement that is seeking to overcome its oppression that somehow is blurring the lines between Jews in Israel and Jews throughout the world, if this makes sense to people. The other thing I would say about this criticism is that I'm sure there is anti-Semitism in the BDS movement on the fringes. I'm sure I have participated in this movement in various ways for many years. I will tell you, I haven't seen it, if it's there. I will say that every movement has its fringe elements. I think if you're going to be a Zionist, there are racist elements in the Zionist movement. Even if you're a very progressive Zionist or progressive supporter of Israel, that means you are lumped together with certain odious types as well. That is the nature of what it means to be part of a movement. And I think it's disingenuous to tar the entire movement because of the actions of a few fringe extremists. The other thing I will say about the BDS movement, and this is again my own anecdotal experience, is that I have found that it is headed up in the grassroots by enormously talented and thoughtful people, especially student leaders on campuses who understand structural racism and who understand the intersectionality between the oppression that's going on in Israel and the oppression that's going on here domestically. The militarism that is part and parcel of Israeli life, and the militarism that's going on in our own backyard, whether it's police departments or whether it's the prison industrial complex. It's very difficult to argue, I think, that BDS opens the door to anti-Semitism when in fact the BDS movement is founded in an anti-racist analysis. And anti-Semitism, when it comes down to it, is just another form of racism. And I've heard over and over leaders in the BDS movement, including many, many Palestinians, denouncing anti-Semitism whenever and wherever it occurs, because it is a form of racism. And ultimately, the racism against Palestinians is inseparable from racism toward any particular people around the world. So, you know, I find the criticism important to respond to, but I ultimately find it really distracts us from the real purpose of the BDS movement, which is equality and democracy and dignity for all people who live in the land, whether they happen to be Jewish or not. I want to conclude by addressing just a little bit the current state of affairs, and by current I mean the last 2 weeks, because I think we may be seeing maybe the tentative beginnings of a paradigm shift going on. I think the recent election in Israel has really opened the eyes of many, many people, particularly in this country, about the reality that has been ongoing in Israel. You know, there's been a lot of talk about Benjamin Netanyahu, about the audacity of his speaking for Congress, behind the back of our president, and the role of Republicans, and doing an end run around our administration's foreign policy. And there's been a great deal of talk about Netanyahu's attempts to win the election, which he did quite soundly, through the means of racist appeals to the Israeli public. You know, during the election, he was tweeting and speaking on YouTube, falsely saying that Palestinians were busing in Arabs in droves to vote, and we needed to. He was encouraging people to go to the polls to combat that. I mean, it's a patently racist appeal to the baser elements of the Israeli public. And he publicly said right before the election that if he was elected, there would be no Palestinian state. And there's been a great deal of attention given to Netanyahu personally for these statements. And I agree I personally find them